On September 13th, 1848, a 13-pound iron rod, more than a meter long, was blasted straight through a man's skull. In one cheek, behind his eye, through the front of his brain, and out the top of his head. It landed dozens of feet away, smeared with what it had carried out. And a few minutes later, the man sat up. He spoke. He walked to a cart and rode into town. His name was Phineas Gage, and the accident that should have killed him instantly instead gave birth to modern brain science. Let's talk about Phineas Gage for a second, because to understand the miracle, you have to understand the man before it. In the summer of 1848, Gage was 25 years old, and by every account, he was exceptional at his job. He was a railroad construction foreman in Vermont, leading a crew building a new line for the Rutland and Burlington Railroad. His employers later called him the most capable and efficient foreman they had. He was strong, balanced, well-liked, and trusted with the most dangerous task on the whole project. And that task is what you need to understand next. To build a railroad through solid rock, you have to blast it apart. And in 1848, that meant doing it by hand, one careful, deadly step at a time. The process went like this. You drill a deep hole into the rock. You pour in blasting powder. You add a fuse. Then you cover the powder with sand, and you gently pack it all down with a long iron rod, a tamping iron, so the force of the blast goes into the rock instead of back out at you. Gage had a tamping iron made specially for him. It was about 3 feet 7 inches long, 1.25 inches thick, and it weighed over 13 pounds. It tapered to a point at one end, almost like a javelin. It was a tool he had used safely thousands of times. But on this one afternoon, something broke the routine. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, Gage was preparing a blast. He was leaning over the hole, packing it down with his tamping iron. For a single instant, he was distracted by, some accounts, looking over his shoulder at his men. And in that instant, the iron struck the rock and threw a spark. The powder ignited while his face was directly above it. The explosion fired the tamping iron upward like a rocket. It entered point first under his left cheekbone, passed behind his left eye, drove up through the front of his brain, and burst out through the top of his skull near the hairline. The rod kept flying. It came down somewhere between 25 and 80 feet away, depending on the account, landing in the dirt, far from the man it had just passed through. And here is the part that nobody on that work site could believe. Gage was thrown onto his back. His body twitched in a few convulsions. His men stood frozen, certain they had just watched him die. And then Phineas Gage spoke. Within minutes, he was talking. With a little help, he stood. He was walked to an ox cart, and he sat upright in it for the 3/4-mile ride back into the town of Cavendish. He climbed off the cart largely on his own and sat on the porch of the hotel to wait for the doctor. And quick, if a man surviving that, conscious and talking, already sound impossible, tap the like button. It's the one thing that tells YouTube to show this story to more people who'd want to hear it. And let's keep going. When a local physician, Dr. Edward Williams, arrived, Gage was so calm and lucid that the doctor almost didn't believe what he was being told had happened. Gage reportedly greeted him by saying that the iron had gone through his head, and according to the famous account, told the next doctor, "Here is business enough for you." That second doctor was John Martin Harlow, and he's the reason we know this story at all. Harlow took over Gage's care, and he documented everything, carefully, for the rest of Gage's life. And the early days were brutal, not from the wound itself, but from what followed it. In 1848, there were no antibiotics. The real threat now was infection. And within weeks, an infection set in. Gage developed a fungal infection and a serious abscess. And for a time, he slipped into a semi-conscious state. His family is said to have had a coffin ready. But Harlow drained the infection and fought for him. And slowly, impossibly, Gage pulled through. Within about 10 weeks of having an iron rod blasted through his brain, Phineas Gage was up, walking, and out in the world. He had lost the sight in his left eye. Otherwise, his body had healed. And if true stories this impossible are exactly your thing, This channel is nothing but them, a new one here every couple of days. So subscribe and stay with me, because the body healing was never the real mystery. The real mystery was his mind. Physically, Gage had recovered, but the people who knew him began to say something strange and unsettling. They said he was no longer Gage. The reports describe a man transformed. The old Phineas had been responsible, polite, shrewd, and steady. The man who came back, according to Harlow's account, became impatient, profane, and unreliable. Full of plans, he abandoned the moment he made them, unable to hold to a course. His friends said the balance between his intellect and his impulses had simply been destroyed. The thinking was there. The brakes were gone. And this is where the story became one of the most important cases in the history of science. Because the rod had torn through a very specific region, the front of the brain, the frontal lobe. And here was living proof, walking around, that damaging that one area could leave a man's memory, speech, and strength intact, while seemingly reshaping his very personality. For the first time, doctors had hard evidence that who you are, your judgment, your character, your self-control, might be rooted in specific physical pieces of the brain. Phineas Gage became the case that helped launch the study of the brain and the mind. He is still in neuroscience textbooks today, nearly 2 centuries later. So before the end, I want to ask you, do you think the man who survived was still really Phineas Gage, or a different person wearing his face? Tell me in the comments. I read them, but here's the part of the story that often gets left out, and it matters. Over the years, the tale of the no longer Gage monster grew taller in the retelling, far beyond what the evidence supports. Because Phineas Gage did not simply fall apart. He adapted. After his recovery, he worked caring for horses, and then, remarkably, he traveled to Chile and worked for years as a long-distance stagecoach driver. A demanding, complex job that required him to manage teams of horses, handle passengers, and navigate difficult routes day after day. A man supposedly destroyed by his injury held down one of the most demanding jobs imaginable on another continent for years. Many scientists now believe Gage's brain partly relearned and recovered over time, which may be just as important a lesson as the injury itself. And here is the number that still doesn't feel real. Phineas Gage lived for almost 12 more years after a 13-pound iron rod passed through his brain. He finally died in 1860 in San Francisco from seizures that were likely a long-term result of the old injury. And his story did not end in the ground. His family later allowed his skull to be recovered, and today his skull and the very tamping iron that went through it are kept together at a medical museum at Harvard. The proof is real, physical, and still sitting on a shelf. And that's the thing about the human brain that nobody ever really prepares you for. We think of ourselves, our patience, our character, the person our friends know, as something separate from the soft matter inside our heads. Phineas Gage proved it isn't. An ordinary railroad foreman, on an ordinary afternoon, had a piece of who he was driven out through the top of his skull by an iron rod, and survived to walk the earth for another 12 years, teaching science a lesson it could never have learned any other way. A man took an iron bar through the brain, stood up, and asked the doctor for help. That's real. If this story surprised you, the like button is right there. And if you want more stories that should be fiction but aren't, there's a new one here every couple of days. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next.